My name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director of the security solutions here at Pathlock. Just a little bit about me. I started with the PeopleSoft systems back in 1997 while everybody was attempting to get off of the mainframes before Y2K and all of those types of things. So I started with version 5. Before I left my last organization, I had upgraded them to the 9.2 platforms in financials and HCM. The campus system was still behind that a little bit. I did go through the campus HCM split through the separation of those particular instances. And I've also worked on all of the different tools releases. So I've touched, upgraded, basically as enterprise architect, all of the releases between 5 and 7. I've worked in oil and gas, retail, and higher ed. As higher ed, I was part of the higher education user group. I was chair of the technical advisory group twice. In a 6-year period. So that's just a little bit about me. Now moving on to Pathlock and who we are. Pathlock is really a market leader in application governance, risk, and compliance. What we have here is a team of certified auditors and the industry's foremost application experts providing comprehensive suite coverage. You can look at some of the customers and people that we work with down below, but what we really focus on is application access governance, continuous controls monitoring, and cybersecurity application controls. We'll be going over more of the application access governance stuff today. Some of the enterprises today, if you think of what's happening inside of their organizations, 75% of organizations of the controls they're using are still tested manually, despite having 7+ tools and service providers on average. 49% reported material weaknesses in 2022, and it's growing each year. And it's really the complexity of the environment and the multiple applications that they're using that I think is driving this across the organizations as a whole. 30% growth in audit costs last year, consistently above budgets, and a 5 times ROI for Pathlock customers are auditing is what we're seeing based on the controls testing and reduced costs and risks up to 80%. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the topic today. Looking at a lot of the PeopleSoft systems, there's a lot of status quo. And this really, I think, probably is the same across a lot of ERP systems. There's a lot of manual communication and processes, multiple stakeholders, tedious access reviews. If your organization even performs an access review, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we're going along. But, you know, from an onboarding perspective, I remember going back to all of my organizations, it was always a very slow process. And it took a long time before somebody was actually productive inside of the application and for that organization, because it was something to where there weren't a lot of set controls, there weren't a lot of set security. So from the perspective of, oh, we've got a new developer, we're going to bring them in. Well, copy them after Greg. Well, Greg's a PeopleSoft admin, we can't do that. So do it after Jimmy and those types of things. So it becomes really difficult. And then there's so much ripple of the security that they need access across the system, whether that's files shares, directory access, read-write access to these particular locations. They also need certain security inside of the target systems, whether it's HCM, financials, or campus solutions, for example. So there's a lot of human error, there's some trial and error, and you end up with misaligned resources across the board. So that's what we see a lot of the times in many of the different PeopleSoft systems, and some of those common access management challenges. It's manual and time consuming for users onboarding and offboarding. It's difficult to be able to get rid of them. It's also, if I go back and talk about some of the post-incident responses that I've done, it's an area where many organizations get in trouble. It's because they're not offboarding people, especially in the development systems. They think, I'll turn them off on production, but I forget that we have a stage or a QA system that's still publicly available. And then all of a sudden, their credentials are still active inside of that system because they're just waiting for the weekly or monthly refresh of that particular environment to be able to wipe out all the IDs. So you can't really wait on that. There's some organizations that have gotten dinged with that, specifically is making sure that you're turning off that access as quickly as possible in many of the environments. So it seems to be kind of a driving decision factor in the environment right now. PeopleSoft authentication is complicated since PeopleSoft lacks, native SAML integration with an enterprise IAM solution. Think SSO, multi-factor authentication. It's just one of those things that post-COVID, a lot of people and organizations push to integrate into their enterprise-wide single sign-on solutions. It's just the way many organizations want to go, and that really will help with the offboarding of organization or offboarding of users as well. Kind of that first bullet point. If you can implement a SSO solution. Also, there's a lot of requirements, especially President Biden's got a thing out there where it's, you have to provide MFA to be able to, touch certain data and all of that type of situation. So it's a requirement that's coming in. And if you think about it from a cyber insurance policy and scenarios like that, it's really kind of due diligence. This is something that you have to do. And if you don't perform those things, or you're not enacting these things, then you're probably not going to be covered in the first place. Many people are involved in access processes, the requesters, the users, reviewers, the approvers, a lot of touch points. Also, the question is, who's actually making the requests, who's approving the requests. I talk to a lot of organizations where the person who requests it's the same person that approves it, because it's really coming in from the product or the business owner. Should it be coming from the employee's manager? Should it be coming from the employee themselves? What's the best way for that to actually really come through as a request point? Because you really need that separation of requester to approver, so that there are those auditable steps that it's going through, so it makes the auditors happy on the back end, which in turn, what I've seen a lot of too is rubber stamping of access. The approvals of it, if they are doing user access reviews for that yearly certification, many of the PeopleSoft customers just don't do UARs, at least not efficiently. It's very manual, a lot of Excel spreadsheets, and it's just process flow that many people hate from that side. And Oracle provides no centralized platform to manage access and roles across multiple applications. So it does become a little bit of a challenge when you have HCM, financials, campus, maybe the interaction hub, and you're running all of these different systems, and people have different access points in all of them. And you've got different touch points of whether people have access to query, what are they going to have in setup financials, or set up HCM, set up campus solutions, or set up Stacker, if we want to call it that. What do they have from query? What do they have from people tools? There's lots of layers of different security that people have access to inside of the PeopleSoft systems. And then you have the additional data layer that somebody could connect into at that layer as well. So when we think about managing the risks in PeopleSoft, it really is crucial. An untimely security audit, it's going to be something that the audits are never at a time when they're convenient. You think about just managing and the workflows of what needs to happen on a PeopleSoft system, whether it's maintenance, patches, fixes, tools upgrade, dot releases, all of those types of things are occurring. Plus, you're talking about your customizations that you've put in, your business processes, annual processes. We were just kind of talking about it before, with the information of, August is kind of hard for a lot of the higher ed customers that we have, because right now most of the students are moving back onto campus. So, it's just a lot of events are occurring inside of these organizations. So security audits are never at a time where it's convenient. At least I've never had one. So being able to respond to those is always a challenge, and it's always extremely time consuming. Inefficient SOD conflicts and monitoring processes. It's something where, when we look at PeopleSoft as a whole, managing the SOD, which is separation of duties. So it basically means that if somebody has access to, let's say in payroll, for example, they could create an employee and they could also pay an employee. Well, you shouldn't be able to do both of those, because then you can actually, create a fake employee and start paying that person and stealing money from the organization, for example. So that's kind of an example of an SOD. The same thing can happen in financials, where you can create a vendor vendor and pay a vendor. So you want to make sure that people don't have those access points to be able to do those. And then manual user provisioning and deprovisioning, we're going to go into a lot of that today. So I'm going to continue to touch base on that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it right now. Complex internal controls and checks. That's often one of the challenges that many organizations have is the processes that they're currently going through now are very complex. Some of them are antiquated, some of them are very old. I talk to a lot of organizations, on a daily basis to where when we talk about provisioning and deprovisioning, it's something that somebody might have written 10 to 15 years ago that's no longer with the company, and absolutely nobody knows how to support the thing. So how are we going to manage those risks? How are we going to implement all of those things? So, and then you end up with inaccurate and time-consuming audit reports, which kind of comes back to the untimely security audits. You know, the inaccuracy stems from the fact of, sometimes understanding of the PeopleSoft systems themselves, and it's always time consuming. I go back to, I had to respond to all of the audit reports because I was the enterprise architect, and, it was one of those things that the auditors always dinged me specifically because I had access to a all powerful role as well as my own, and how are we differentiating between those, and how do we know that I'm doing one thing under the other and not accessing other information, under the admin account and things like that. So, having access to information to what the users are doing in the system really can help trim down the time consuming part of that information inside of the system. So, and really increasing regulatory compliance mandates, those aren't going to change. They're probably going to continue to get worse. I think I've said this before, you've probably heard it before with GDPR, it really gave teeth to a lot of the mandates that are out there, with the fact that there were so heavy fines related to a breach or, something that caused a failure within the GDPR mandate. So, a lot of organizations, don't want to have to deal with that. They don't want to have to pay that, but a lot of government organizations want the money as well. So it's how do we deal with that? Each and every year, there's more and more countries coming on with a GDPR type solution around private data, who's got access to it, being able to track it. Here in the United States, we don't have a nationwide version, but there's a lot of states. I want to say there's somewhere between 14 to 18 states that are activating or going through the legislation of coming in with new regulatory compliance around personal data. So it's not something that's going to get any easier in the short term. And ironically, on that particular piece of data, we were working with some customers in the higher ed with the Supreme Court ruling about utilizing race in college admissions and those types of things, and that it can't be utilized. So, they wanted to come in and mask data, so they used our security platform to be able to do that, to protect that data and pull it out. They're still capturing the data most likely, but they're pulling it off of the pages so people can't see it, things like that. So, it's really all about access and mitigation of the PeopleSoft risks, and how do we mitigate, and how do we do that? And the PeopleSoft market is adopting automation. I don't know any team out there that's too large, too big, and has way too many people that they know what to do with. It just doesn't exist today. So automation is enabling organizations to do more with less, and it's about power. And automation is powering the analytics and algorithms to streamline the GRC strategies, governance strategy. So we do that multiple different ways, and there's really a couple of challenges around that. Automation is something that's very key and important in a lot of these systems. One, it kind of comes down to automated provisioning, which is really a challenge because provisioning itself needs to be done compliantly. It's very important that you don't over authorize a user inside of these systems to where they end up having more control than they should and be able to perform like an SOD violation and then such steal money from the organization as a whole. So automated provisioning is something that needs to be thought of. Because typically once a user gets these roles and the authorizations inside of the systems, it's very difficult difficult in some orgs to have them ever remove that. It's something that over provisioning is a real challenge across multiple organizations, and it's just because of the migration of the users inside of their org as itself, because they're not going to stay within one job. They're going to migrate between those different jobs inside of the organization, and with that, they're going to end up with additional privileges. So if those privileges aren't cleaned up and they're not taken away, then that person's going to end up with more authorizations than they should. And if you've automated all that, typically it doesn't necessarily remove the things that it needs to, because there's challenges around that. Recommendation engines, by that I mean, what are we able to do from the perspective of, having access to, let's say they need an authorization. Well, can I use an existing role? Do I need to create a new role? What do they really need to be able to do and access, and how do I streamline that to make it efficient for them long term? And then automated risk analysis, that could come in from user access reviews that are current, that are just scheduled and running and looking at your systems. And then cleanup analytics. How much are you actually doing maybe on those user access reviews? Are you removing roles? Are you removing access? Which really brings us to the challenge of automating the user lifecycle. And what we do at Pathlock is we really help solve this problem as a whole. So when we look at the user lifecycle, and you think about this as how they're going to be within our organization as a whole, what job function are they going to be doing? What is their life cycle? And one of the ways that I like to boil this down to is you're going to start with role design, and the role design really is going to give them the authorizations to do whatever they need to do, right? So that could be job function or employee function. Maybe you're hiring this person to be an AP clerk. Well, before you hire them, they're still an employee, right? So they have their roles and authorizations that they need to perform at the employee level. I am just a base employee of this organization. I have to be able to do my benefits, my payroll, all of those types of things, right? So that's my base authorizations that I'm going to end up with. So that's an easy role to design and build. Now, when you're talking about the additional access that somebody may have, there's a couple of ways that you can automate that or go through those particular processes. So really, it's designing the roles in a way that makes sense for your organization, which Pathlock really enables us to do. And I'll show you that here in just a second, which really is going to drive the provisioning and deprovisioning. That role design is key, and that's one of the reasons why it's first. Because when you talk about provisioning and deprovisioning, it's about deploying the role-based access controls and automating that user lifecycle management. So, whether you're onboarding that person, when am I going to do that? Am I going to do that when they're hired, when I bring them into the organization from a campus perspective, when they're matric, when I recruit them, when they admit, or when they commit? When and where are you going to do that for your organization? When do they become an employee or a person of interest that you want to put then into your HCM system, for example? So, and really create an employee ID for them and start tracking them. So that's really where, a lot of the questions around provisioning and automating that process, really makes sense. And when you're talking about deprovisioning, what are you going to do from a business process and role design there? Are you still doing taxes, for example? Do you still have to provide a W-2? What are you doing for that person after they are no longer an employee? Maybe they need benefits and those types of things that they still need to be able to get in and access and pay for those. So multiple different things can happen when you're talking about how do I onboard and how do I offboard. And then in the middle, you have that whole process of, this person is moving throughout all of their different life cycle and their jobs inside of my organization. So when you talk about that moving around those different jobs, you can manage the access requests compliantly. The requests can come in. We've got a self-service portal to be able to do that. We can integrate with ServiceNow, for example, as well. So it really allows you to come in and say, hey, I need Jimmy as that AP clerk now. He's going to move out of his role as just as employee, and he's going to get all of these new roles so that he can actually perform that job. All right, great. So I can make that request. That can go over to the correct person and it's going to get approved at that particular point. Well, then we can go ahead and apply all of those. The reason you want to do that, it kind of goes back to that process flow, is now all of your, from an audit perspective, all of your requests, all of your approvals, all of the workflows, all of those things are in one particular place. So now it's going to help on your audits. It's going to be able to trim that time that you're going to have to go looking for. You're not surfing through, different email accounts as to who replied to this email. Did they reply to the email? All of those types of things. It allows you to have a centralized location to where all of those different requests can be made, tracked, approved, denied, maybe additional information needs to be required, those types of things. That brings us to the user access reviews. When we're talking about a user access review, typically this is a real challenge for a lot of organizations. There's also different requirements, maybe from the perspective of, as a whole, as an organization, let's say you have 10,000 users. How often do you really have to do all of those 10,000 users? Let's say we're looking at an HCM system, or maybe, a financial system where everybody submits their expenses that way. So, all right, everybody has access to expenses. Okay, how privileged is that? It's kind of self-service access. So maybe we only have to do the entire user community once a year. But then when you slice and dice that into the other user groups that you have, you're going to have administrators of the product. You're going to have power users of the product. Going back to, some of those SOD violations, we have somebody who's going to create vendors. We have somebody who's going to pay vendors. We have somebody who's going to do AP and all of those types of things. We got people who are going to do payroll, somebody who's going to do benefits. So we've got all of those different job reviews, and we need to understand what they have access to. And maybe some of those people have access to multiple different systems. They could have access to HCM, financials, and maybe campus solutions, for example. So, how does their access sit across multiple different systems? And then when we look at it from the perspective of taking all of those in, how do I want to schedule those? Maybe those high privileged users I want to do quarterly, maybe once every 6 months. I don't know what's the requirement. I was talking to a group the other day that they've had some challenges on their audits. So they've been pushed for high privileged users to do monthly, monthly user access reviews. I don't know anybody who likes to do a lot of user access reviews, but to have to do 12 a year would be pretty challenging. But it's because they kind of got themselves into that situation. That's because of having, I'm not going to say material weaknesses, but it's something that, they've had enough issues on their audits that they need to then show that they are moving forward and putting the correct steps in place. So user access reviews are very, very important because it's going to allow you to approve that or reject the access that they currently have. Improving audit and effectiveness and scope is really around the SOD audits and sample testing and violation management. I like to talk about these as a group because really the SOD audits are understanding, and that going back to, that's the separation of duties. And really what that means is, I gave a couple of examples earlier, but it comes down to the fact of a user has both sides of the activities that create a violation. So if they only have one side, let's say they can hire employees or they can create employees, but they can't do anything in payroll, for example, that's only a one-sided. They have to have both sides. So it's, yes, I can hire an employee, and yes, I can pay somebody, or yes, I can create a vendor, and yes, I can pay that vendor. So you have to have both sides of the equation to really have that jump out at you from that perspective. So that's really where the sample testing comes in, is to, all right, Jimmy has both of these, or, is he creating any SOD violations? What has he done? And then what do I need to do from a violation management? How do I mitigate this? What do I have to do to correct it? So that's why when we look at automating the user lifecycle, it's important that all of these things are taken into effect. They all have to be leveraged to do this efficiently and compliantly. That's the key term there, is really compliantly, because if you're not looking at SOD rule sets, for example, how are you going to provision and deprovision and know that you're not over authorizing that user, and thus causing your organization more of a challenge on one of the back end issues here than moving forward? So here at Pathlock, we have a really unique governance approach that focuses on the data security. So from the Pathlock perspective, we've got fine-grained access analysis and provisioning, capabilities into many different business applications. We can also see deep transaction inspections of did do, versus can do activities. And we can look at understanding that. We integrate directly into the systems themselves to be able to provide dynamic access. So we can read directly and work directly in your PeopleSoft systems, which is what you're going to see today. And it allows a centralized policy management. So I'm not going to go too much into the other side of it. You guys can read through that. From the perspective of tangible day one benefits for governance, automation, and cost reduction. From an IT perspective, everybody always has different goals and objectives as to what they want to get out of a project like this. So it's how do we do this in an effective manner? How do we do it in a way that is going to allow everybody to gain something? This is a win-win for everybody rather than for IT, it's a win, but for the business, it's a loss. No, we don't want that. We want everybody to get a win. So from an IT perspective, you can see a 50% task reduction. Why is that? Because we can automate many of the things that they were having to do before. And you'll see that through this process flow. So they're having to touch less and they can focus on the things that are more important. So it automates reporting to the business, for example, reduces the risk of a breach. Why? Because we can automate that provisioning. We can onboard and off those users very, very quickly. And it's driven based upon events inside of the HCM system. The business users, it's going to reduce the workload of the team in control testing. Why? Because things can be tested and you set up certain business roles, you set up access to the system, so those are going to be targeted, streamlined, and effectively tested. You can also speed up the provisioning request in UARs. It's more of a click of the button, and when you're dealing with the audit response on that or somebody coming back and asking you for all of the detail, you're not going to have to be asked for it. The auditor can go into the system, get it themselves. So about a 70% cost reduction there. Internal controls and audit is going to be empowered to access the data directly. So they're going to be able to utilize the Pathlock system, and it's going to be accurate and reliable. Why? Because it's based upon what's happening inside of the systems. And the external auditors can have access to that too. So it reduces some of the needs for the consultants. And you can shift how you really look at this more from a transactional based to a risk based. You can step up another layer. So there's an 80% risk reduction there as well. So now let's look at a demo. So I'm going to toggle out of here and bring up another application. And we're going to look at this a couple of different ways. So let's start with trying to think of how I want to do this first. So let's go about hiring somebody or going through an onboarding process. So I'm actually going to touch on a couple of different PeopleSoft systems, and I'm also going to touch on a couple of different of my demo systems as well. So from this side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to matric a student and I'm going to onboard that student and create security for that student. So I'm going to sign into Campus Solutions here real quick. And what I'm going to do is, if you think about Campus Solutions, it's much like HR and the fact that you're recruiting people, right? And you want those people to come to your organization. Same thing as HR. It's either going to be for a job or you want to educate those users. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to see if I've got a list in here. Nope, I don't have it. So I will go back to the main menu. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to student admissions, and I'm going to go to application maintenance, and I'm going to go to maintain applications. The reason I'm doing this is I used to work in admissions, and one of the things that from a business process flow, when you onboard a student, it's going to occur at different times, but it's typically going to be around the event of matricing that student. So what it does is it means to the organization, hey, they're going to come to this, they're going to come to our school. So what we want to do at that particular point is we need to create, we need to do things like, things like create their account, give them an email, give them access to whatever information they need, set them all up inside of our network, so we're going to create them in the student system. We're going to do all of those other types of things. So what I was looking for is a program status here of an application, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift them into the next stage. So I'm going to go ahead and matric them. So from an HR perspective, this is extremely equivalent to I am now hiring them. So I'm going to put in an MATR row here, and I'm going to tab out of there. I'm going to go ahead and create that program. So what it's doing now is it's kind of hiring this student, but it's moving them from the application side. So this is inside of Campus Solutions. It's specifically moving their data from owned by admissions to now it's going to be owned by student records. So inside of our system, I'm going to flip over to one of my demo systems. We've got some different workflows that are set up. They're built. Before I do this though, real quick, one of the things that I want to do is I want to grab this employee ID. I'm going to pop open a new window. My demo system is running a smidge slow at the moment. So it created the program, it grayed all of that out. So now what I want to do is let's do a new window just so I can keep up that one. And I'm going to go back home, and I want to actually open I believe I probably have it here, user profile. So on the user profiles, I'm going to go ahead and put in their employee ID, hit enter. You can see that no employee ID exists under that particular user. So I'm going to go back over to our process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run an organizational sync. So I'm going to kick that off as I'm talking about it, because it's going to take a minute to run. What this process is doing is it's going to effectively go out into and communicate with that PeopleSoft system and see what data has changed. So log in. Obviously, I talked long enough that I got timed out, so I'm going to go ahead and kick that off. So what it's doing is as I said, it's synchronizing this data, and we can see that it's currently running. So what we're doing is we're reading from the PeopleSoft system, and we've defined this process to look for students that are matricked. And when that student gets matricked, what they're going to do is we're going to create their PeopleSoft account. We're going to give them certain permissions. Why are we going to be able to do this? Because we can do this automatically. One, because we have some business roles that I'll show you in just a second. And those business roles are going to be granted to that account. It's going to go through the processes that it needs to go through and apply baseline security. I like the term baseline security or least privileged from that perspective, because least privileged we know is going to be tested by the organization. It's only going to allow access to the features and functions they need to perform that base role. Think about it when I was talking about the employee. You hired Jimmy to be an AP clerk, but Jimmy's still an employee first. So he has to go through and do his benefits, all of those types of things. Well, in this scenario, as a student, we're going to go through and they need to be able to do their things as students, add and drop classes, right? They need to be able to maintain their own organizational data and those types. So I'm going to look at the workflow that we have created. And what we've done is we've got a workflow that was fired. So I'm going to open up that request here real quick and see that this just happened. We can see the username, number one, that was the username that was created. So I'm going to dig into that request a little bit further and get some additional information. So number one, what we have is the request is going to come through. This is the username. It was opened by the system, right? There wasn't anything that needed to occur. All of this was done systematically because we now know we're going to set it up as our process flow is going to say, when I hire a person or when I matric a student, I want to create them and I want to give them least privileged access. So we've done that. We've got their name, their employee ID, what their employee number was, and we've got the actions that took place. From an auditability perspective, this occurred inside of the system. We created their user account, we added authorizations, and we finished. Did anybody really need to be involved in that process? No, they didn't. because it's an automated process flow based upon utilizing business roles and things that we have defined and built inside the system. So if I come back over to the PeopleSoft system, I'm going to search real quick, and now we have one. This user exists, they have the primary permission lists, all of those types of things, their ID ties back to their employee ID, and they have these 7 roles. Where did these 7 roles get defined? So I'm going to go back into my system here, and rather than looking at the workflow requests, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at business roles. So as I open up a business role, keep in mind going back to that life cycle management of what a role is. That's why it started at the beginning. I have a role defined as PS student. What this does is it's got about 875 activities. We can see all of the different activities. They're included within this role. So we can see each one of those. So this is built and defined. I know now when a student comes in or an employee comes in, they can have a base role that's going to be very strict, and this is what they're going to have access to. Here are all the activities that are included in this. Think of component page that they've got access, if that makes sense. So what target system is this in? You can see it's campus, PeopleSoft Campus. Why? Because we're cross-platform. You can do HCM, you can do financials, you can have multiples in there, for example. So that's one of the things of how we can do that. So we can automate that process flow very easily, and you can tie those business roles in. So all you have to do from a workflow perspective, and I'll show you that workflow again here real quick, and let's actually do managing of the steps, because I want to show you just the flow chart, because we have a nice flow chart. So it's going to be triggered by an event. We're going to create that new user. We've got data. We're going to add the authorizations, and the workflow is going to be completed. So everything has a workflow. Very easy to understand what's happening in this situation. I don't need to have an approval with this. Why? Because it's going back to me applying least privileged access to this user. If I were to come back in and look at, if I could spell today, employee profile is where I wanted to go, and I'm going to put in that same employee ID. We're going to go ahead and pull information. We can see what their username is in what target system. So if this user had access to multiple different systems, think Active Directory, financials, HR, whatever systems you want, they can all be listed here. We can see what roles they actually have access to, and from an auditability perspective, when were they created? They were created in the automatic student account, which occurred at this particular point in time. Again, can drill into the details, and you'll see that just as it was before. Complete full life cycle management, all auditability, much easier to maintain and drill through and understand what was done. What I wanted to do now is I'm going to talk specifically about I wanted to talk about user access reviews, because it seems to be a very big stickler of a challenge area for many organizations. So I'm going to really jump at it a couple of different ways. I moved over to a different demo system that I have here. We've got a couple of different ways that we can access a user access review. One of the reasons why I wanted to show you a couple of ways to do this is because it always comes up. How do I know when and where that I have an access review? How do I know I need to do something? So inside of our Pathlock Cloud system, one of the things that we have is a portal page. That portal page allows you to drive into whatever you need to do, whatever's been assigned to you specifically. We also have, from that side, is we also have an inbox. So the inbox is going to be a list of the things that are waiting for you to do. So when a user access review is run, it's going to go ahead and load into your inbox. So multiple different ways to get there. It just allows you to manage that whichever way you really want to look at it. So since I'm also an administrator, I can have different access to either way. Sometimes you might want to control it. So it depends upon how you want to look at that. So one of the things that you'll notice is we've got an access certification here for PeopleSoft Financials. We also have one for financials and human capital management. The nice part about this is we are cross-platform, as I was talking about earlier. So it allows us to see what that user may have across multiple applications. So it really allows you to tie into the effect of, all right, Jimmy has X in HR and X in financials, for example. So if I go ahead and drive in and we can look at some of the details inside of this review, it's going to go ahead and pop out into a new window. And so we've now got our access certification. All of this content up here at the top, I'm going to call it content because you can really customize what you want this to say. So that way, as the user's interacting and working with this information, you can easily update and have it say whatever you want to say. As I scroll through, these are all of the people that I need to review. Obviously, there's going to be more users than this defined within the system, but I can pick and choose who I need to access and who I need to approve based upon these are the people that report to me, for example. So I'm just going to pick Diane Christian here, and I'm going to open this up. And as I do, we're going to be able to see what type of activities they have. So here's information as to the employee herself. We have things like her hire date. When did she join the organization? What is her job title or employee ID? What department, higher level department, specific department is she in, and where is she at from a, global perspective inside of my organization. We've got multiple, obviously a lot of customers out there that are global. So where are they at? Because this could tie into things from GDPR and privacy laws and those types of things. So why do I want to know this? So here are all the roles that they have access to. She works inside of the general ledger, and we can see that she's got a couple of high risk activities here. Easily we can come in and approve and reject. We can put in comments, those types of things. The other nice part about it is, let me see what this role consists of. So if I drill into the general ledger, I can see specific functions that are defined and built within inside of this particular activity, but then I can also drill into more detail to be able to understand what actual true activities does this user have access to within that role. So think about this as the perspective of component page. So these are the component pages that this user has access to. So you're able to understand and drill into that off of that role. This is what that user has the ability to do. So it gives you that that option to drill in. You can either approve or reject that right then and there. You can do it, save as a draft. You can reset it. All of those types of things. Inside of the PeopleSoft system, you've got a couple of roles that are pretty much, everybody needs to be able to use to access the system. We can look at the high risks inside of an activity role. So it's going to go ahead and tell me specifically what those high risks transactions are. So remember when I was talking about this earlier with SODs and violations, and that's why I like to look at this holistically, because it allows me now to pivot and understand, oh, these are the things that I need to be concerned about. This is what this user has access to that might give me heartburn at night, rather than having to deal with the mundane of, oh, this user was created, like we just talked about from that example with the campus solutions and creating that user all the way through. I can spend less time focusing on something like that and more time actually focusing on what's important. What are the risks that are happening inside of my system? Who has access to what? These user access reviews can be kicked up and run. You can do them ad hoc. You can do them whenever you want to. Typically, a lot of organizations will run them at least quarterly. But the nice part about it is it's going to show up in your inbox or for your list to do, and then you're going to be able to knock them out and move on about your day. So it's really convenient from that perspective. I'm going to back up here real quick. And one of the things that I wanted to show you as well is it kind of comes into a question of, what can be done. I'm going to actually pop out. I'm going to grab one of these. Now, granted, this is a little bit different. It's not a PeopleSoft system, but if I jump in and look at one of these, we're going to be able to review what they have access to in multiple systems. But the nice part about it is we can, on the certain workflow events, approve and reject can be treated very differently, just as an FYI. So you can have workflow events, much like what we saw within the other system. So if I open up this one, I'm going to manage the steps here to where you can actually see this. This workflow is doing certain things. Well, when you're talking about access certifications, let's say you reject it. Well, does that mean you want to go out and remove the role? Yeah, well, we can go do that for you automatically. Once again, now it's going to be consistent. Oh, okay, great. That we want that one done. Boom. Once that's done and approved, we can go out there and remove that. You know, somebody going back to the operational savings, somebody in IT doesn't have to go do that. We can automate that entire process for you. And then just as you saw, you know, the creation of the account, adding all of the roles, doing all of that in PeopleSoft, we've already got that built. We've got those connections for you. So that's where, you know, being able to tie into that becomes really empowering to the organization as a whole. I know I'm kind of going through a lot of this very quickly. I just kind of wanted to go back to the portal look and feel, because some of the things that I wanted to show here, you know, it's very easy. If I hit, you know, my certifications, it's going to be that same list. You know, I'm seeing the same type of information, just depends upon how I want to access it. The access request, this is a scenario where we can come in and have that additional access request. Going back to that user lifecycle management, how do I want to manage those users moving forward? If I go ahead and create them with all their least privileged access to do their core functionality as an employee, now I can come in and say, oh, Jimmy needs that AP role. All right, so I can come in and say modify access. Jimmy needs to go through, and we've got a workflow. What happens at the end of the workflow? You know, I'll throw in here test. We can pick the system. You know, once again, let's say it's financials. All of those, you know, we can walk through these business processes, and it's going to allow you to come in and select the roles. They're going to be able to pick and choose what roles they have. Maybe you want to copy them from a user. So Jimmy's coming in and replacing somebody else. Let's go get Sally's roles or Paul's roles, whoever they are, and we can do that. You know, and they can have the exact same access and setup just like that particular user. So you can have all of those choices. The nice part about it is once you're done, you know, you can submit that. That can go to the proper request channel. Once that gets approved by the functional lead, the business owner, whoever's going to do that, it can route then over to security. Security can approve it, process it, be done with it, and we can apply all of those new roles into that user right then and there. Once again, the you know, security doesn't have to go in and automatically or go in and do it all. We can automate that process. Why do we want to do that? Because then everything's consistent. It's done. There's speed. You know, all of that stuff's involved, but it allows you to have all of these contained in one particular place, which makes all of your audit reviews much easier because of the workflows and the audit trail inside of the system. So with that, I'm going to go back to the presentation here real quick and talk a little bit about, you know, why Pathlock is designed the way it is, and it's really designed for value. As you can see, efficient provisioning. That workflow is going to automate that joiner process. It's going to automate the leaver process. It's going to be able to do that when and where and how you want to do it. As you can see, that was built based upon campus solutions. I could have done the same thing in HCM. Do we want to do it on a hire? You know, somebody coming in for a job? Do we want to do it on the person record creation? What makes the most sense? You know, that comes back to what is your process flow. And that's where we can tie into how you generate and how your system works and tie that into efficient provisioning throughout your entire user lifecycle management. You know, being able to control SOD, prevent fraud. You can define and build your own risk matrix to ensure that you're compliant with, you know, legislation and to satisfy the auditors. You can, you know, add in very quickly each sides. You know, okay, if a user has A and B or A, B, and C, then they're gonna, you know, this is an SOD violation that we want to track. What we're going to be able to do then is quickly compare it to all of the different roles and authorizations that are out there doing those UARs. We're going to be able to tell you, bam, these are the users that have those authorizations. They're the ones that need to be mitigated. They're the ones that need to be looked at. You know, so we can manage the role-based access control proactively. You know, you can move away from a very complex mitigation to a security model that's stable. It's consistent. You know, as you could see, we set up that business role of student. We can set up that business role of an employee. Why would we want to set up a business role as an employee with base, you know, streamlined access that's least privileged, we want to do that. Why? Because now in onboarding and offboarding, maybe it's the fact of when I onboard, they get that base role with least privileged. They go about getting a new request for security. You go ahead and add that. They get those new roles. Let's say they get terminated or they decide to retire or they're, going to leave the organization and go off to somewhere else. At that particular point, they're going to go back to maybe that base role of employee, or another, another base role of, terminated or ex-employee. Why? Because now we have, you know, taxes, W-2s, those types of things that are in there and no other access to anything else. You can quickly make those to where they could have been applied to those users. And now all of a sudden you're not worried about, oh, what access do they have anymore? They're terminated. We applied that. It's done. It happens automatically to the system. So it's going to simplify the access reviews and other controls. As you can see there, the user access reviews are going to be much easier. They're a lot flexible. You can really set them up to target the groups that you want to for the times that you need. Obviously, you need to do probably an entire review once a year. That's just good business policy, moving forward like that. So Pathlock really is the solution designed for value. It's going to get you there very quickly. Because we've already got integrated touch points into the PeopleSoft system, we can pull in all of your accounts very quickly and start looking at those UARs very, very quickly. So this is just something that I wanted to walk through a couple of those different demos, show you some of it. And with that, I'll say if there's any questions, just utilize your GoToWebinar control panel. It's typically on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can submit any questions there. I know we've got about 5 minutes left in the session. I just wanted to make sure that we had enough time for Q&A. And with that, Stephanie, I will open it back up to questions and throw it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for that presentation. Again, yeah, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box now, and we would be happy to answer those. Our first question is, from an automation perspective, where are some of the bottlenecks you have heard from customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. The bottlenecks that really stem that I've seen are kind of twofold. One's going to be around the user access reviews and just the difficulty of doing those. I was presenting at a conference here in spring a couple of months ago, and I asked everybody who was in the room how many of them actually did a user access review, and I think one company out of the whole group did a user access review. So obviously that's something that's standing in the way. The other side about it is, speaking with other organizations, it's the onboarding process or the offboarding process. Because now the question is, what occurs within my identity management system, for example? So how do I, going back to single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, as I onboard, I'm going to treat an employee differently than somebody who, might be a retiree, for example, but they still have access to the same PeopleSoft system. So how am I going to treat them differently? What am I going to do with them? How do I make sure my system is secure? So, some organizations, especially in retail, for example, they may hire and fire 10 to 15 to 20,000 people a year. It's very difficult to make sure that they, I'm going to use the word assimilate, but to get them within all of your systems to where they have the proper single sign-on, the proper multi-factor authentication, because it's difficult to create all of those accounts inside of Active Directory or Okta or whatever IDM that you're using, in situations like that. So, and provision all of that across the board. And that's something to where, from our compliant provisioning, not only can we create the PeopleSoft accounts, we can create the accounts in other systems based upon that business event that occurred within, HCM, for example, and they're hired and we need to create all those accounts. We can also turn those accounts off. So, when you're talking about worrying about, how many accounts we have, what are we going to get charged for this? That's typically why you have those move off with the retirees, because you don't want to keep them on your identity management system because you don't want to pay for them. So those are probably the three areas of bottlenecks that I see the most.
Great, fantastic. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. If you do have any more questions, please reach out to us at info@pathlock.com and we would be happy to answer any of those questions. And be on the lookout for other webinar events that we'll have coming up. And with that, we just want to say thank you so much for attending and we hope to see you soon.